Picture a checkout line at a grocery store, maybe Tuesday afternoon. The fluorescent lights are humming. There's a woman, you can see she's had a long day, unloading her cart milk, bread, ground beef, some apples. Her kid, maybe 5 or 6 years old, is fidgeting beside her, clutching a small chocolate bar like it's, the most important thing in the world.
Like gold.
Exactly. Just simple stuff. The total comes up. The woman slides her EBT card. Then there's that pause.
The awkward pause.
Yeah, and the cashier, with this sort of practiced, apologetic look, leans in and says really quietly, "I'm sorry, but this." And he gestures to the candy bar. It's not covered anymore.
Ooh, yeah.
He doesn't make the rules, right? He's just the messenger. But in that one small, really awkward moment, you see everything.
You do.
The kid's face just crumples, totally confused. The mother gets that quiet flash of embarrassment, having to explain something that doesn't really make sense.
And it's not about the money, is it? The $1.50.
Not at all. It's about the line that just got drawn, right there on the conveyor belt. A line between a basic food item and, well, a tiny moment of joy.
A little treat.
Yeah. And it makes you wonder, who is drawing these lines and why? What's the actual goal here? Because honestly, when you start digging into the policy, it seems pretty clear it has almost nothing to do with nutrition.
That scenario, that $1.50 denial, it's such a potent image, isn't it? It's the perfect picture of this kind of micro-policing.
Right.
And it really says a lot more about our societal priorities, I think, than it does about actual dietary health. We're going deep today into the specific effectiveness and the ethics of restricting what people can buy with SNAP benefits.
SNAP being the Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program.
Right. And looking at, recipient autonomy in the U.S.
Exactly. So today, we're doing a really comprehensive deep dive into the system behind that moment at the checkout. We've looked at a ton of research, randomized controlled trials on health outcomes, the history of welfare reform, huge federal subsidies, the works.
Yeah, quite a bit.
And our mission really is to unpack 3 basic layers of this whole debate, to try and understand why we focus so much attention on policing the grocery carts of the poor.
Okay, so layer 1. We need to seriously look at the effectiveness and the ethics of these purchase restrictions. The ones done in the name of nutrition.
Right.
We have to get past the rhetoric and ask, does banning a soda or a candy bar actually lead to measurable health improvements? Or is it mainly, moral judgment dressed up as policy?
And then the second layer, we'll dig into the ideological shift, this embedding of work requirements and this intense focus on individual responsibility right into the safety net.
This is where we look at the political economy of it all, how these rules are maybe more about managing and policing people than tackling systemic issues like unemployment or economic hardship.
And finally, and this is where that $1.50 line really throws things into sharp relief. We're going to contrast this microscopic focus on SMP with the huge scale of corporate subsidy.
It's a big money.
We'll investigate how public funds are actually allocated in the U.S., comparing SNAP spending to what we're calling the $181 billion leak the flow of money to corporations.
Okay, so let's start with that policy line on the conveyor belt. There's definitely a political push towards restricting purchases, and it's really picking up steam at the state level.
It is. Back in April 2025, the USDA basically opened the door. They invited waiver requests from governors to test out strategies that, quote, promote nutritious food while also limiting what you can buy with SNAP.
And that was a major signal, a real policy shift. We've seen things move fast since then. Now, what is it, 12 states?
12 states, yeah. Arkansas, Idaho, Iowa, Indiana, Nebraska, Utah, Texas, Oklahoma, Louisiana, Colorado, Florida, and West Virginia. They've all been approved for various kinds of restrictions starting as early as 2026.
So this isn't just talk anymore. It's happening. It's going to affect millions of low-income families.
And one of the immediate problems right off the bat is the lack of clear guidance. The USDA guidance encouraged states to restrict non-nutritious items like candy and soda, but
they didn't define non-nutritious.
Exactly, no clear standard definition.
Which, predictably, leads to a patchwork. Inconsistent, sometimes kind of arbitrary restrictions across these states.
Like what? What are the differences?
Well, you've got some states, like Nebraska and Utah, just focusing on sugar-sweetened beverages, SSBs.
Okay.
But then you look at Idaho, Iowa, Indiana. They're expanding the bans. Gatorade is out in some cases. Even sweet baked goods.
Wow. Imagine being a grocer trying to keep track of that. Or a recipient just trying to buy groceries.
It's an operational nightmare. Total confusion.
So when proponents push these restrictions, what's their main argument? It seems to be mostly about making programs consistent.
Yeah, that's a big part of it. They argue that restricting SSBs and sugary stuff aligns SNAP with other federal nutrition programs.
Like WIC?
Exactly. The Special Supplemental Nutrition Program for women, infants, and children and school meal programs already restrict SSBs. Plus, tobacco and alcohol are already excluded from SNAP. So the argument is, let's standardize the federal approach, promote better health, reduce consumption of things linked to diet-related illnesses, make it all consistent.
Which, sounds reasonable on the surface.
Yeah.
But the ethical counterargument really hits hard on autonomy and dignity, like that mother with the chocolate bar.
Precisely. The critique is that these restrictions unfairly limit food choices, specifically for people with low incomes, and that increases stigma.
Yeah, the judgment factor.
Right. When policy goes beyond basic support and starts micromanaging choices, it can really strip away dignity. Critics say it's more about moral judgment policing whether a mom buys a birthday cake mix than practical help.
And might even push people away from the program altogether.
It could. Some eligible folks might just opt out rather than face that kind of scrutiny at the register.
Which is why we need to look hard at the research. Does restricting purchases actually deliver better results than, say, offering incentives for healthy food?
The evidence is pretty nuanced, and honestly, a lot of it undermines the restriction-only idea. Well, modeling studies do suggest that if you just ban SSBs, spending on them could go down, maybe by $1.16 to $4.80 for every $10 restricted.
Okay, so people buy less soda if they can't use SNAP for it. Makes sense.
Right. But the key metric is overall diet quality, and that's where it gets complicated. Does banning soda make people eat healthier overall?
Which brings us to the big studies, the randomized controlled trials, the RCTs. They compared restrictions, incentives, and combining the two. What did they find about changing behavior?
So in one major RCT, the group that only had restrictions did, as you'd expect, cut back the most on SSB purchases, about $1.40 less per week.
Okay.
But, and this is crucial, that same group had the smallest increase in buying healthy stuff, like fruit, only about $1.70 increase per week.
So they stopped buying soda, but they didn't really shift that money to apples or oranges.
Exactly. They probably shifted it to other things that weren't restricted, but maybe weren't that healthy either. Other energy-dense snacks.
Interesting. What about the other groups, the ones with incentives?
Now, compare that to the group that got incentives plus restrictions. They got discounts or bonus bucks for fruits and veggies, and they couldn't buy SSBs. This group saw the biggest jump in fruit purchases, up by a significant $4.80 a week.
Wow. Quite a difference. And what about the overall health impact? I remember seeing a pretty shocking statistic about diet quality actually getting worse with restrictions alone.
Yes, that finding is critical. It really challenges the basic assumption behind restriction policies. In one study, restriction alone actually worsened diet quality. It led to a negative 2.3-point change on the Healthy Eating Index.
Okay, hold on. We need to pause there. For our listeners, what exactly is the Healthy Eating Index, the HEI, and why is a drop of 2.3 points a big deal?
Right, good question. The HEI is a tool developed by the USDA. It measures how closely someone's diet matches the federal dietary guidelines for Americans. Scores go from 0 to 100, higher is better. So a 2.3-point drop is statistically significant. It suggests that when you just take away one unhealthy option, like soda, people don't automatically switch to broccoli. They might switch to other equally unhealthy, non-restricted things, maybe chips, cookies, processed snacks, things the policy didn't target.
So it's like playing nutritional whack-a-mole, and you might actually make things worse.
That's a good way to put it. The policy becomes a game of whack-a-mole with potentially negative health outcomes.
So it really reinforces the idea that the incentive works better than the stick, the ban.
It seems so. The combined incentive plus restriction model in that same study showed the most significant increase in overall diet quality, a positive 4.1 HEI point change compared to the control group.
Plus 4.1 versus minus 2.3. That's a huge swing.
Huge. And that combined model also significantly reduced food insecurity.
So if the real goal is improving public health,
then the evidence overwhelmingly favors solutions that either boost total benefits or offer incentives for healthy food. The restriction-only approach. It's poorly supported by the evidence and, like we saw, maybe even counterproductive.
Which leads directly to the question, who's actually pushing for this? Because when you ask the people using the program, there's a major disconnect.
Oh, completely. Surveys of SNAP participants are incredibly consistent. What do they want? They overwhelmingly favor increasing total benefit support is up around 86%.
Okay.
And they strongly support healthy food incentives up to 90% back those.
And restrictions.
That's the least favored approach. Support for banning candy and soda is down around 29 or 30%. Very low.
Meanwhile, surveys show that people not using SNAP, the general public, are much more supportive of restrictions.
Right. Which really suggests that these restrictions are being driven more by outside judgment, maybe ideological ideas about personal responsibility.
Not by the evidence.
Not by the evidence of what works best for health, or by what the recipients themselves say they need for their families. It feels much more like policing behavior than making a smart public health investment.
This whole conversation about what you can buy flows pretty naturally into that much more intense ideological battleground. Who should even get benefits?
Exactly. And that's where the rhetoric of individual responsibility gets dialed up to 11, using work requirements as the main tool, the main stick.
Right. Think about that hypothetical Bill, the former factory worker. His plant closes, he needs help, signs up for SNAP. And suddenly, in the political narrative, he goes from being, a regular working guy hit by economic forces to being the problem. The guy who needs to be managed, policed, the target of speeches about ending abuse.
Yeah, the narrative totally shifts the focus away from the systemic reasons for his unemployment, the factory closing, and puts it all on his personal choices, whether that's the $1.50 set chocolate bar we talked about, or just the fact that he's currently jobless.
And this focus on the stick, on work requirements, isn't new. It goes back decades, right, to the 70s?
It does, but it got much, much stricter in the mid-90s. Let's break down how these requirements work in SNAP today.
Okay.
So basically, there are two main types. You've got the general work requirements, which apply pretty broadly, and then you have the really stringent rules for ABWDs, able-bodied adults without dependents.
ABWDs. That acronym itself sounds kind of clinical, detached.
Yeah.
Who are these people in reality?
Well, they only make up about 12% of SNC households. And crucially, the whole idea that they're just sitting around avoiding work, that's largely a myth.
Really?
Yeah. The evidence shows most ABWDs who can work are working, often in low-paying jobs, unstable jobs, seasonal work where the hours fluctuate like crazy.
So SNAP is helping them bridge the gaps in unsteady income.
Exactly. It's supplementing low, sporadic earnings for many of them.
But the requirements are tough. How are ABWDs limited?
Okay. Under the ABWD rule, they can only get SNAP benefits for 3 months within a 3-year period.
Just 3 months.
3 months. Unless they can prove they're working at least 80 hours a month or they're in a qualified job training program.
80 hours a month? That's like a consistent part-time job.
Right. And the system isn't really set up to support job hunting during that time. It's more about creating this really high bar for compliance, for proving you meet the threshold.
So let's get to the core question, the evidence. Do these intense requirements actually succeed in increasing employment? Because that's the stated goal, right?
That's the justification, yes. But the evidence is remarkably clear, and it basically says no. No. A big review of the best available research concluded that work requirements do not increase employment and have negligible, tiny impacts on earnings, if any.
So they fail at their main stated purpose.
Fundamentally, they don't achieve the goal of boosting labor market participation in any meaningful way.
Okay, so if they don't help people get jobs, what do? What's the actual measurable effect of these policies? What are they effective at?
They're incredibly effective at one thing, drastically cutting program participation, slashing caseloads. That is the primary undeniable outcome. One major study found that when these work requirements were fully enforced, you saw a 23 percentage point increase in people exiting the program among ABOWDs.
23% more people leaving.
And overall participation among the entire group subject to the rules dropped by a staggering 53%.
53%.
Yeah.
But that drop isn't because they all suddenly found great, stable jobs.
No, it's largely due to attrition and administrative failure, people getting kicked off or giving up because they can't navigate the system.
So the complexity itself becomes the barrier.
Exactly. The complex rules, the constant need for documentation, proving those 80 hours when you might be juggling multiple gigs, the periodic recertifications. This administrative burden is immense.
Right.
And it disproportionately pushes vulnerable, eligible people out. Just complying with the paperwork becomes almost a job in itself, which is often impossible if you're dealing with unstable work, transport issues, maybe unstable housing.
We saw the human cost of this kind of administrative barrier really starkly with that Arkansas Medicaid experiment, didn't we?
Oh, absolutely. That was in 2018. They applied work requirements to Medicaid. The results were devastating.
So
In less than a year, 18,000 low-income people lost their health coverage. And the reason? Almost entirely administrative. They couldn't navigate the complex online reporting system. It wasn't necessarily that they weren't working the hours.
they just couldn't prove it in the right way at the right time through the right portals.
Precisely. And the follow-up studies showed severe consequences.
Like what?
Among those who lost coverage, half reported taking on serious medical debt. 56% delayed getting necessary medical care because they couldn't afford it.
That's awful.
And it's not just Arkansas. When the Congressional Budget Office looked at work requirements for health coverage, they reached the same conclusion. Massive coverage losses, with essentially no change in employment or hours worked.
So these policies basically function as a way to cut costs by making the program too hard to use, even for people who are eligible, and meet the work criteria on paper.
That's what the evidence suggests. It's cost-cutting through bureaucratic attrition with very real human costs.
To really understand how we got here with this punitive structure, we need to go back to that big shift in 1996, the welfare reform.
Right. The Personal Responsibility and Work Opportunity Reconciliation Act, PRUARA, that was a seismic shift in American social policy.
It replaced the old system, AFDC.
Yes, Aid to Families with Dependent Children, AFDC. That was essentially an open-ended cash entitlement program focused primarily on basic survival for poor families with kids.
And TANF replaced it.
TANF, temporary assistance for needy families. And the focus shifted dramatically. It moved away from just survival to emphasizing work, job preparation, and marriage.
And the big changes were ending the guarantee of benefits and putting in that 5-year lifetime limit on federal cash help.
Exactly. And the immediate intended effect was a huge drop in caseloads, a 63% decline between 1996 and 2005.
Which sounds like success if your goal is just shrinking the rolls.
If that's the only goal, yes. And employment among some former recipients did go up, especially during the strong economy of the late 90s. But the overall U.S. poverty rate barely budged.
Really?
Yeah. And critically, the situation for the poorest Americans actually got worse. Deep poverty people living below half the poverty line increased after the reform.
Wow. So AFDC, for all its issues, was actually doing a better job of protecting the most vulnerable.
It seems so. Before 96, AFDC lifted about 64% of kids who would have otherwise been in deep poverty, out of deep poverty.
Okay.
By 2005, less than a decade after the reform, TANF was only lifting about 23% of those kids out.
That's a massive drop in effectiveness for the poorest kids.
It's stark evidence. TANF succeeded in shrinking caseloads and saving federal dollars in that category, but it really failed the poorest families and seems to have worsened deep poverty.
And the way TANF was structured as a block grant that also led to cash aid itself, kind of drying up in many places, right? Creating huge differences between states.
This is a super important point about the political economy of it. Converting AFDC to a flexible block grant gave states enormous power over how to spend the federal money.
And they didn't always use it for cash assistance.
Increasingly, no. Instead of focusing on direct cash aid, many states started shifting TANF funds away from checks for families and towards other things, maybe politically safer, things like child care subsidies, administration costs, other programs.
What was the actual impact? How much money was really going to cash aid?
Well, by fiscal year 2007, for example, only about 30% of all TANF funds nationally went to basic cash assistance.
Only 30%.
Yeah. And the result was this wild variation across the country. In some states, like Idaho or Wyoming, the share of poor families actually receiving any cash welfare plummeted to just 2%.
2%?
Compare that to states like Maine, California, Vermont, where it was still over 45%. The block grant structure basically allowed many states to effectively starve the cash assistance part of welfare, making aid incredibly hard to get and often too little to live on. It achieved the goal of reducing welfare rolls, partly by just making the program less available and less helpful.
Okay, so we've established this picture. Intense focus, bureaucratic hurdles for people like Bill trying to meet work requirements, policing what people buy down to a $1.50 candy bar.
Right, microscrutiny.
But now let's zoom way out. Let's look at the absolutely staggering amounts of public money flowing, often with far less scrutiny, in the completely opposite direction.
This brings us right to the core contradiction, the hypocrisy in how we allocate public money. Remember Sarah, the community college student?
Yeah.
She saw the absurdity of the state meticulously checking her $2 gummy bear purchase, while at the same time approving millions in tax breaks for some giant corporation moving nearby.
That kind of spending on social safety nets, SNAP, TANF, Medicaid, It dominates the political conversation about government spending, doesn't it? It's often painted as this out-of-control behemoth.
And the numbers are large, no question. Back in 2011, just as an example year, federal spending across 83 different overlapping means-tested welfare programs hit $1.03 trillion.
$1 trillion.
Yeah. The federal share was about $746 billion. That total was more than Social Security that year, more than Medicare, more than non-war defense spending. So yes, it's a huge amount, and it's constantly under political attack, facing demands for cuts and accountability.
Okay. But what about the other side of the ledger, corporate welfare? Spending that often flies under the radar without the same kind of moral judgment attached? How big is that pot of money?
Research estimates put federal spending on corporate welfare at around $181 billion per year.
$181 billion annually. And what exactly does that include?
We need to be clear. It includes direct cash subsidies paid to companies, indirect support for specific industries, and also government-subsidized businesses like Amtrak. This is what we're calling the $181 billion leak.
And this $181 billion figure isn't static. It's actually growing fast, especially because of recent big legislative pushes.
Oh, absolutely. Things like the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, the HEPS Act for semiconductor manufacturing, and particularly the Inflation Reduction Act, the IRA.
Right.
These have pumped hundreds of billions more into the system in the form of new subsidies and special interest tax breaks. The IRA alone is estimated to funnel something like $540 billion in corporate welfare over 10 years, mostly targeted at industries like green energy, batteries, semiconductors.
Okay, so if the argument against social program spending is often about waste and fiscal responsibility, why do critics argue that this $181 billion leak, this corporate welfare, is actually far more damaging economically and, well, morally?
Because of the profound inefficiencies and the moral hazards baked into it. The first big critique is just misallocation and outright failure.
How so?
Subsidies basically bypass normal market signals. Money gets directed by politics, not necessarily by good business sense. So funds often flow to projects that are either not really needed or are just fundamentally unsound.
Can you give us some examples of these kinds of failures?
Oh, history is littered with them. Way back in the 80s, the government poured $1.7 billion into something called the Clinch River Breeder reactor. It was eventually canceled because the technology was obsolete.
$1.7 billion down the drain.
Very much. More recently, remember Solyndra?
Vaguely, yeah. Solar panels.
Right. They got a $535 million federal loan guarantee during the Obama administration. Then they went bankrupt. Their panels weren't competitive. The tech was iffy, management issues. Poof. $500 million gone without the promised jobs or a sustainable company. Subsidies guarantee funding. They don't guarantee success.
Okay, misallocation is one thing. The second major critique seems almost inevitable when politicians are handing out billions. Cronyism and corruption.
Yes, it's almost built into the system. Corporate subsidies are strongly linked to corruption because, inevitably, politicians tend to steer money towards campaign donors, lobbyists, and politically connected firms.
We're not just talking hypothetically here.
No, it's demonstrable. Historically, think Enron, they were masters at leveraging political connections to get favorable deals and deregulation. More recently, critics point to connections between major political donors and companies like First Solar, whose stock price apparently doubled after benefiting hugely from IRA subsidies. Experts consistently argue that you can't really get big money out of politics as long as Congress is in the business of handing out billions in these targeted corporate giveaways. It creates an irresistible incentive for lobbying and influence peddling.
Okay, so beyond outright corruption, there's also the massive cost of just the administrative complexity. We saw how that trips up SNAP recipients.
Right, but it impacts corporations getting subsidies too, just on a much, much larger scale.
How does that work?
Well, these subsidies often come with incredibly complex strings attached. Think regulatory hoops like Buy American mandates. These might sound good politically, but they often force inefficiency and drive up costs significantly.
Like for construction.
Yeah, Buy American rules can apparently add around 20% to highway construction costs, and they cause huge delays, especially in fast-moving tech sectors.
Like the semiconductor industry under the GPS Act.
Exactly. The GPS came with all sorts of complex conditions, requirements for employee child care facilities, diversity rules, expensive Davis-Bacon labor regulations.
And a result.
We saw it play out. The big TSMC TSMC chip plant in Arizona faced months of delays navigating all this. Meanwhile, a similar TSMC plant in Japan, built without all the heavy-handed federal conditions and slow subsidy negotiations, got finished much faster.
But the most mind-boggling example of this bureaucratic waste has to be the EV charging station rollout.
It is just astonishing. The Biden administration allocated $7.5 billion to build a national network of electric vehicle chargers.
$7.5 billion.
After 2 years, how many operational charging stations had that investment produced?
How many?
7.
7 stations for $7.5 billion. That level of inefficiency just dwarfs any $1.50 candy bar issue. Where did all the money go?
It got stuck in the gears. It wasn't a lack of funding. It was an explosion of bureaucracy. The money was tied up in navigating overlapping federal and state rules, domestic sourcing requirements, complex bidding processes, permitting delays, you name it.
Wow.
It's a perfect illustration of how administrative complexity, the same tool used to police the poor, also acts as this massive fiscal drain at the corporate subsidy level. Billions turn into administrative sludge.
Okay, and finally, there's the issue of collateral damage.
Yeah.
Sometimes these big subsidized projects, even if well-intentioned, create new problems, like the push for green tech.
Right. This is often the hidden cost. When you pour billions in subsidies into electric vehicles, for example, you create enormous demand for lithium batteries.
Which have to be mined.
And those mining operations often need billions of gallons of water, frequently in drought-prone areas like Nevada. That causes significant environmental damage and strains water resources.
And the vehicles themselves.
EVs are heavy, significantly heavier than gas cars, maybe 20% heavier on average. That extra weight increases tire particulate pollution, which is a growing health concern, and it also wears down roads and bridges faster. These negative side effects often get overlooked in the political rush to subsidize the favored technology.
So when we step back and look at the efficiency of all government spending, whether it's social programs or corporate subsidies, we bump into that classic economic idea, the leaky bucket.
Yes, and this is really important context for taxpayers. Basic economics tells us that because of the deadweight loss of taxation, the drag taxes put on the private economy, it actually costs taxpayers about $1.50 to raise $1 for the government to spend.
So it's not dollar for dollar right from the start.
Not even close. Then you add in all the bureaucratic waste, the potential for fraud, the misallocation we've been talking about, especially in these super complex subsidy programs.
Yeah.
Some economists estimate that for really inefficient programs, it might cost taxpayers up to $3 to deliver a benefit that's ultimately worth only $1 to the person or company receiving it.
$3 in for $1 out.
Potentially, yes. And this inefficiency applies across the board to both social and corporate subsidies. Yet, where is all the intense political focus, the moral outrage, the demand for microscopic accountability? It's almost exclusively reserved for that tiny fraction of spending used by the poor at the grocery store. #V, conclusion and synthesis.
So the conclusion we're drawing from this deep dive seems pretty stark. This whole policy debate around SNAP, it functions like an ideological tool. It focuses this intense, microscopic scrutiny on the choices of the poor, the candy bar, the work paper, while at the same time, it enables these massive macro-level economic decisions, billions in corporate subsidies, huge administrative failures, projects that just don't pan out, that are vastly more costly, far more inefficient, and arguably much more corrosive to the public purse.
And the evidence keeps pointing back to the same thing. The real objective of punitive measures like restrictions and work requirements, it isn't really about boosting employment or consistently improving health.
What is it about then?
Their main provable function is to dramatically cut program participation, to shrink those caseloads, often at the expense of worsening deep poverty and creating immense administrative hassles for the most vulnerable people. Meanwhile, we know incentives for healthy food actually do work better for improving health outcomes.
So all the political energy, all the headlines spent policing the grocery carts of the poorest 40 million Americans, it successfully distracts us, doesn't it?
It absolutely does. It diverts critical public attention, and probably public funds too, away from confronting the multi-billion-dollar the inefficiency, the cronyism, the moral hazards created by this largely unchecked flood of subsidies going to the most powerful economic sectors.
The political choice seems deliberate. Keep the focus locked on the $1.50 line.
So you don't have to talk about the $181 billion leak. It creates this fascinating political dynamic. You keep the public's frustration aimed at the visible, relatable waste of a few dollars in someone's grocery cart.
Right.
And policymakers conveniently avoid the much harder conversation about the multi-billion-dollar cost of rewarding political allies and powerful industries with subsidies that are often inefficient, overly complex, and sometimes just fail outright.
The moral judgment we apply so readily to the mother buying chocolate, it's almost never applied to the corporation lobbying for $500 million in questionable tax credit.
Never.
So what's left for you, the listener, to think about is maybe the cost of that diverted attention. Just imagine for a second, what if the same level of fiscal rigor, the same demand for accountability that's applied to that $1.50 candy bar, what if that was applied instead to the $7.5 billion investment that yielded only 7 EV charging stations? That's a profound misallocation, not just of money, but of our political and economic energy.